We're running a 2-year project that is giving tailored training in conservation, ecology, environmentalism, along with marketing and communications. And this is exclusively for 18 to 35-year-olds to kind of raise awareness about key conservation issues and to hopefully get people to inspire others and teach other people about the environmental issues and conservation challenges that we're facing at the moment. So we're recording this webinar, and I will share it afterwards so that you guys have all got access to it. We're going to go for the normal format. I think the presentation should take about an hour to 45 minutes. And then we can have a bit of a break for to get a drink and whatnot, and then come back and do questions after that. But if at any point you guys want to put some questions in the chat, just to kind of remind yourselves of them, I can read them out at the end for you if you'd like. But I'm just gonna hand straight over to Lizzie from the Vincent Wildlife Trust, who's going to be hosting the talk tonight for us.
Oh, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining on a really nice sunny evening. I am just going to share my screen. Oh, start from the start. Okay, can everyone see that okay? All good, okay. Yeah, so I work for the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and I will explain a bit more about who we are and what we do. I work on our small carnivore program. So yeah, tonight I'm going to be talking a bit about the carnivores that we have in Britain, kind of a bit about their population changes, kind of where we're at now, and kind of threats and opportunities for the future. But yeah, an introduction to Vincent Wildlife Trust, because we're not terribly well known. We are a specialist mammal conservation and research NGO, so we're not part of the county wildlife trusts. We're kind of totally independent. We were founded in 1975, so we've actually been going for 45 years. And we are quite niche in our remit is quite niche, so we specialize in focused long-term solutions for the conservation of rare or difficult to track mammals. And we broadly have 2 programs. So one is working on small carnivores, the other is working on bats, and we have 3 key themes to our work. So the first is on developing innovative monitoring methods, the second is population restoration, and the third is conflict management. So these apply to all of our work for the most part. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about carnivores, but specifically about mustelids. So mustelid is the kind of fancy Latin word for animals in the weasel family. So in Britain, we have 6 native mustelids, 7 mustelids in total, which includes a non-native one. So this photo in the center is kind of a lineup of all of our mustelids, excluding the badger. So I've included it on the right. So the story with this photo is it was sent to me by someone who had collected all of these animals as road casualties and then kept them in his freezer. And then once he had them all, apart from a badger, he thawed them out with a hairdryer and lined them up for a photo to see the size comparison. So I don't know why he didn't have a badger, because badgers are one of the more common of that family. But anyway, starting from smallest to largest, our smallest is the weasel, then we have the stoat, then we have polecat, American mink, which is non-native, then pine marten, then otter and badger. And you would have all of these in Warwickshire apart from pine marten, as far as I'm aware. So yeah, a bit of background. So carnivores in general, so this isn't kind of specific to Britain, it's kind of a global thing. Carnivores have had a very difficult history with humans, and still do, in some parts of the world. And in Britain in particular, our ancestors weren't big fans of carnivores. So pretty much all of our carnivores were traditionally hunted for fur and sport. So this photo here is someone who is otter hunting. So that guy is holding up an otter that he's caught. So yeah, they were hunted for fur and sport. Some of our carnivores were culled for protection of game birds, so things like pheasant and partridge. Most of them were seen as kind of vermin, and bounty payments given in some areas to encourage people to kill some species. So yeah, people were given a financial reward for killing these animals. So yeah, this resulted in like large numbers of most of our carnivores being killed, which led to kind of really severe population declines. So this is another photo of, or like illustration, I guess, of an otter hunt. So yeah, otter hunting was a big thing. It started in the Middle Ages, and people used to use dogs and other kind of tricks to catch the otters. And this is just an example of like the sheer scale of kind of carnivore control or predator control. So these are the numbers of animals killed just on one single estate, Glengarry Estate, which is in the Scottish Highlands, over a 4-year period in the 1800s. So yeah, just in 4 years, 301 stoats and weasels were killed, 246 pine marten, 198 wildcat. When you think about how rare things like wildcat are now, like it's pretty mind-boggling that 198 wildcats were killed just on one estate in 4 years. So yeah, this kind of like war against our carnivores, I guess, was really extensive, and went on through the 1800s and well into the 1900s as well. However, now the tables have turned a bit, and we are living in a more kind of enlightened era. So there are exceptions, but for the most part, a lot of our carnivores have had like a bit of a like rebranding, if you like. So where yeah, we generally have a lot more of a positive view of our carnivores. So here's just like a couple of like news examples, and I will like touch a bit more on both these examples. So what the one on the left is pine martens recovering as a result of reintroduction, and the one on the right is a review that showed that a lot of our carnivores, so here they've use the examples of badgers, otters and stoats, are kind of making a comeback, and their populations are increasing in range and number. So yeah, we have had kind of this quite significant shift over the last well, over 100 years, but more recently as well. So I'm just going to kind of touch on each of our carnivore species. Like some I will talk a bit more about than others because they're ones that I personally work on, so I have like a bit more in-depth kind of knowledge or examples to use. But yeah, starting with the pine martens, as far as I know, this is probably the only native carnivore that you don't have in Warwickshire, but they are, yeah, they're a cat-sized carnivore or mustelid. They are a woodland specialist, so they're normally only found in woodlands. They will use some non-wooded habitats, but they tend to be quite dependent on trees. They are solitary for most of the year, apart from when they're mating and breeding. So they mate in the summer months, kind of July to August, and then they exhibit delayed implantation. So that means that the females don't become pregnant straight away, but they kind of carry the sperm until the winter, and then they become pregnant like the following kind of February. So yeah, the young, which we call kits, are born in March, April. They tend to have like 2 or 3 young, and they stay with the mother throughout that kind of first summer and autumn, and typically disperse like over the winter. And like a lot of our carnivores, pine martens are quite nocturnal or crepuscular, so active at dawn and dusk, but in the summer they can be quite active during daylight hours. And even though they are carnivores, they have an omnivorous diet, so their diet varies seasonally and geographically, but the main kind of staples of their diet are small mammals, and particularly field voles. fruit and berries in the autumn, and then some birds, invertebrates, and they will scavenge carrion as well, so like deer and sheep carrion. And they like to den, so by den I mean like rest and sleep above ground, because this is how they kind of keep safe from other potential predators like foxes, which can kill pine martens. So they like to den above ground in things like tree cavities or old squirrel drays or bird nests, but they will use things like root plates or kind of cairns or boulders on the ground, and even buildings actually. And they can have really large home ranges, so it depends on the kind of availability of like habitat and food, but the largest ever recorded home range in Scotland was 56 kilometres squared, which is a lot of space that these guys can need. So the history of pine martens in Britain, they used to be our second commonest carnivore, or it's thought they would have been our second commonest carnivore in the 1500s, and it's been estimated there would have been around 147,000 pine martens at this time, which is a pretty accurate estimate for something from like 500 years ago. But then they underwent this really significant population decline for two reasons. So the first was woodland clearance. So because we've cleared a lot of our woodland cover for like agriculture, and our woodland cover went down to a low of 5.4% in 1895, and a lot of our woodland tends to be like fragmented and small and isolated. So this was bad news for a species that's very reliant on woodland. But then also persecution. So like a lot of our other carnivores, pine martens were persecuted pretty heavily. So partly for their fur, so pine martens have like really beautiful fur, so they would be trapped for their fur, which was then used for making like coats and blankets, etc. But also for the preservation or protection of game birds. So again, things like pheasants and partridges, which pine martens may take if they have the opportunity. So yeah, their numbers were really hammered. So this was their distribution. I think this was like mid-19th century. So the white areas are where they'd already become extinct, and the green areas are where they were considered common, and yellow is where they were becoming rare. And then at this low point at 1915, you can see they were pretty much wiped out of almost all of England and Wales. Their only real stronghold was in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, where the persecution pressure would have been less. And then they also hung on in parts of Northern England and Wales. This distribution map is roughly their distribution now. So you can see they're still pretty absent from a lot of England and Wales, but it's getting better, especially in Scotland. So pine martens became legally protected on the Wildlife and Countryside Act in the 1980s. But even prior to that, the population started recovering in Scotland around the mid-20th century. This is likely because of reduced persecution pressure, but also because people, we've started planting more trees, and we have an increased woodland cover, which has been helping them out. So yeah, they've been recovering in Scotland since around the mid-20th century, and then now in recent years have been spreading south over the Scottish border into Northumberland and Cumbria. There have been a couple of reintroductions. So pine martens are currently being reintroduced to the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire. So this started in 2019, and the second phase of the translocation is due to happen later this year. And then we also carried out a reintroduction in mid-Wales, which we did between 2015 and 2017, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So this has also helped the population in Wales kind of get kick-started again. And then, yeah, as I was just saying, Joanna, there's a kind of these isolated populations in Shropshire and in the New Forest in Hampshire as well. But so pine martens still are rare. They're currently our second rarest carnivore after the wildcat. So yeah, they're still rare in most of England and Wales. And the most up-to-date population estimate for them is around 3,700 animals, and these would mostly be in Scotland. So yeah, Vincent Wildlife Trust and I've been quite involved in some of this work. We've been leading quite a lot of conservation efforts for pine marten. So yeah, by the kind of 1990s and 2000s, we'd realised that populations of pine martens outside of Scotland, so in England and Wales, were really showing no sign of natural recovery as they had in Scotland. And those kind of remnant populations that were hanging on would be really vulnerable to kind of total extinction. And natural colonisation to Wales and also kind of central southern England from Scotland was incredibly unlikely due to the kind of barriers, like landscape barriers in the way. And there's a lot of kind of arguments for restoring and recovering pine martens. So they are a native species, so they have this kind of intrinsic value. It's argued that they're seen as this like iconic woodland species. People are becoming increasingly familiar with this kind of idea of ecosystem services and the value that certain species, particularly predator species, can have in their kind of native environments. So in order to start restoring pine martens, we initially carried out a 2-year feasibility study, and a lot of this was based on a habitat suitability model. So because pine martens are woodland species, they need extensive areas of woodland primarily. So we needed to identify areas that would have sufficient woodland for them. So this is a map that was produced from that habitat suitability modelling exercise. So you can see the areas that are kind of highlighted and like have little names by them. These are the areas of extensive woodland that were kind of really highlighted in the model that might be suitable for pine marten releases. And we were looking for areas that had a minimum habitat area of about 3,000 acres, and also connectivity to other woodlands, and then also minimum potential conflict and full support of local communities. So particularly with carnivore reintroductions or carnivore recovery programs, it's so important to get the kind of social feasibility right, which typically has often been ignored in the past. So it's easier to get the biological feasibility right, but the social feasibility is just as, if not more important. So there's no point in releasing animals in an area where people don't want them, and then there'll be conflict, and then people might kill them or just won't tolerate them. So yeah, that was a really important part of the feasibility study. And we settled on a release area in mid Wales, which is, I don't know if anyone knows this area, but in the woodlands, like broadly east of Aberystwyth, there's lots of nice contiguous extensive forestry. And as part of the feasibility study, we were following the IUCN guidelines for reintroductions and other conservation translocations. And we had to identify where the pine martens would come from, where we were going to transport them from for release. So it made sense to take them from Scotland because that's where pine martens are doing really well in recent years. So we had to carry out surveys in Scotland to identify source sites or donor sites. So these would be sites where we could capture animals for release. We also had to collect lots of kind of baseline data in the release sites in Wales, so on things like prey availability and like woodland structure, that sort of thing. And then also extensive community and stakeholder consultation, because as I said, the kind of social feasibility and acceptance is really important. So one example of this this OS map gives the name of a river, which is Avon Bell. So in Welsh language, pine marten is Bellacoed, which literally translates to cat of the wood. So this is the River Bell, which it's thought would have been named after pine martens, obviously going back like hundreds of years. So it just highlights, that pine martens are a native species and they're kind of ingrained in the landscape and kind of cultural heritage. So yeah, those are the kind of things that we were looking at. And then after the 2-year feasibility study, we were then ready to start releasing animals in Wales. So we did this in 2015, 16 and 17 over 3 years. So in total, we translocated 51 adult pine martens. So these were all caught in the Scottish Highlands. We were working with a wildlife vet, so every animal we caught underwent a full health check, and we took kind of various samples like blood samples, fur samples, and they were kind of given a full clean bill of health. and then they were fitted with radio collars and also pit tags, which are like microchips that you would have in cats and dogs, so that we could monitor them once they were released in Wales. They were then translocated to Wales overnight in an animal van. So this is an example of they were put into these like carry crates, which are kind of like what you'd take a cat to the vets in, and they were fed and given water at regular stops over the journey. We fed them blueberries because they love blueberries, and in this photo a pine marten's being fed blueberries on a spoon, and they eat them in a kind of really adorable way. And then once they got to Wales, they were kept in a pre-release pen, which was a 2x3 meter pen. I'll show you on a video shortly. And they were monitored remotely with like remote trail cameras, just to check that they were behaving normally and kind of not showing any adverse side effects from their long trip from Scotland before they were released. So this differs to some reintroductions would do a hard release approach, which is literally where the animal is transported to the release site and just let go straight away. A soft release is thought to have higher success rate in having the animals stay close by once they're released, which is obviously what you want because you've chosen that release site for a reason. So you don't want them to run 200 miles away to a completely different area. So this is, to play. This is an example of a pine marten in a release pen. So you can see it's wearing a radio collar, which is how we were monitoring them. The food like platform that you can see in the front of the video is what they were fed on every day. So they were kind of given food that they would have sort of similar in their natural diet. And then the box that the pine marten's just climbing into is what we call a den box. So it's basically like, it's similar, it's like the bird box equivalent for pine martens. So it's a big wooden box and we put them up on trees, and the pine martens, they're really popular for them to rest and breed in. So each release pen had one of those for the animals to sleep in. So once all of the 51 animals were released, and this was over 3 years, we did lots of post-release monitoring. So initially, this was via radio tracking, but the batteries in the radio collars lasted about a year. And then after that time, we were reliant on non-invasive methods. So we've been using things like camera traps, and then like non-invasive genetic surveys, so looking for scats, which are droppings, and hair tubes, and then also getting sightings from members of the public. So since that time, since the first releases in 2015, we've had breeding confirmed in the population every single spring, which is like a really key kind of success indicator in any like reintroduction or recovery program, is to have breeding, because obviously that is a good indication that the population is doing well. We had a really low mortality rate of the released animals, and the population is kind of growing and spreading into new areas all the time. So yeah, the project's been really successful. And then so in the last couple of years, like once the releases were finished, we've sort of been taking the project into the wider community. So one of the things we've done in the release area, so this is in a little village, again, sort of near Aberystwyth, we worked with a railway to take over. So this tiny building was a weighing bridge station, and it was kind of abandoned or like unused. So we have turned it into like a little interpretation centre about the project. So it has lots of beautiful artwork, and you can like read all about pine martens and about how they were brought back to Wales. Iolo Williams, if anyone knows of him from Springwatch, he's the patron of the project. So there's a little video with him talking on it, and he's, yeah, really keen on pine martens. So yeah, we have that, which is really popular, particularly with visitors, and people can sort of like leave notes if they've had a sighting or anything. We've also had like lots of nice interpretation put up. So this is a statue that was commissioned and done by a local artist and is in the car park of one of the woodlands where the pine marten is released. So there's Yolo Williams in that bottom photo. So he was there to kind of like unveil the statue. And then on the right is just an example of an interpretive like display board. So we have a few of these out and about in the local woodlands as well. And then, as I mentioned, the follow-on from the project in Wales was in the Forest of Dean. So yeah, in 2019, we started a reintroduction in the Forest of Dean. This project is actually led by Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, but VWT is a partner on the project along with Forestry England. So yeah, the project began in 2019 and there will be further releases happening later this year, hopefully. And then those releases will be complete, and then that project will kind of go more into like the monitoring phase. So that's it on pine martens for now. So going on to one of the pine marten's relatives, which is the polecat. So polecats are quite widespread in Warwickshire. So it might be, I don't know if you've ever seen one, possibly dead on the road, or it might be something that you're more familiar with. But polecats are known to a lot of people familiar because they're the ancestor of the domestic ferret. And like pine martens, they are mostly nocturnal, but they do have kind of increased activity during daylight hours in the summer. And again, like pine martens, they're solitary for most of the year, apart from when they're breeding. So they mate between March and May, and then the kits are born at this time of year actually, so kind of May, June. They can have really big litters of up to 10 kits, although not all of them would survive, and they stay with their mother through the summer and then disperse in the autumn. And unlike pine martens that have a very kind of varied, opportunistic diet, polecats have quite a more restricted diet. So in Britain, most of their diet, like up to 90%, is actually rabbits. And then they also do take some rodents, so particularly rats, and occasionally amphibians. And it's thought the name polecat comes from the French poule-chat, which translates to chicken cat, which is referring to the fact that if they can get their hands on a chicken, they will take chickens. And they, in the past especially, they were kind of seen as like a real pest to kind of poultry keepers. So unlike pine martens, they don't have really strict habitat requirements, so they're not dependent on any one particular type of habitat. So they live in a wide range of habitats. They do tend to be more numerous in kind of lowland landscapes. They have quite small home ranges, so the male home range can be, well, up to 4 kilometers squared, but the females can be more like around 1 or less than 1 kilometer square. And polecats like to use kind of linear features to get around the landscape, so things like woodland edge, hedgerow, field boundaries, and in the winter especially they will often den or like sleep in farm buildings, probably because they can get rats to eat in there as well. And yeah, so unlike pine martens that like to den above the ground, polecats like to den under the ground or on the ground. So they'll commonly den in rabbit burrows or kind of other burrows under the ground, also things like haystacks and log piles, and yeah, farm buildings like I mentioned. Increasingly we see reports like as they're moving into new areas, they will use people's gardens, and we've had reports of them denning in people's sheds or like under their garden decking or garages. So they do seem to be able to tolerate some level of like human alteration of the landscape. So the history of polecats in Britain is very similar to pine martens. So they were thought to be our 3rd commonest carnivore during the Mesolithic era, and it's estimated there would have been about 110,000 polecats during this time. And out of all of our carnivores, they probably had the worst reputation. So the word polecat was used as an insult, and still like occasionally is, like it was used in Shakespeare as an insult. And they were really killed in really high numbers, higher than any other animal apart from the mole, apparently. So yeah, the map here is their distribution in 1880. So the white areas are where they have become extinct already, and the dark green areas are where they were still kind of common and doing well. So even by 1880, they were becoming scarce across most of England and Scotland. And then they really hung on in like mid Wales and also like the border counties, so Herefordshire and Shropshire. And then the same as pine martens, they kind of got to this low point around the like early 1900s, like 1915. So their distribution then was they had become extinct almost in all of Scotland and England, and then just had this kind of stronghold in mid Wales and yeah, kind of Shropshire, Herefordshire, possibly a little bit in the north of Scotland. And yeah, similar to pine martens in Scotland anyway, and they started to recover from the mid 20th century onwards, and the population started to expand out of Wales back into England. And this recovery was linked to a reduction in persecution. So what we saw with all of the carnivores actually is that there was a real reduction in gamekeeping activity and the number of gamekeepers employed after the World Wars, because a lot of people who would have been employed in gamekeeping went off to fight in World War I and World War II, and obviously didn't come back. So there was a reduction in kind of the number of like gamekeepers active in the country around that time. Also, what would have helped polecats is the banning of a device called the gin trap, which was a trap that was commonly used actually to mostly to kill rabbits, but polecats and other species were vulnerable to being killed or injured in the trap too. And then the increase in rabbit population that we saw towards the end of the 20th century would have helped polecats as well, because they do seem to be quite dependent on rabbits in this country. So Vincent Wildlife Trust has been, our main involvement with polecats has been tracking the kind of range expansion of polecats as they've moved out of Wales and kind of moved back into their like former range in parts of England. And the way we've done this is kind of like a citizen science approach to collecting data and collecting records. So we've been, a lot of it has actually been based on road casualties, because polecats are really hard to see. So you're probably only ever going to see one like running across the road, and you might not know that it's a polecat. But where they are widespread and kind of doing well, they are quite good at getting themselves run over. So if you live like where I live in North Gloucestershire, it's quite common to come across road casualties, which even though that's sad, it's a sign that the population is actually doing quite well. So yeah, we've been quite reliant on people kind of reporting road casualties to us. So the last national distribution survey we did, which ended in 2016, this was the kind of distribution that we're looking at now. So in the last 100 years, polecats have really done really well. Like they've gone from just being in that part of like central Wales to now being all the way over to East Anglia and Kent and down into Devon and Cornwall. They're still absent from most of Scotland. But there have been reintroductions in northwest England. So there was a reintroduction in Cumbria. There have been a couple of reintroductions in Scotland that possibly haven't been successful. So the latest population estimate for polecats is 83,300. So they are a lot more abundant and widespread than pine martens, possibly because they aren't so fussy in terms of habitat use, but also because their population probably never fell quite as low as pine martens did. So yeah, pine martens and polecats are kind of our two species that have probably had like the biggest kind of population changes over the last like 150 years. I'll just touch on a few of the others. So stoats and weasels are interesting. So neither of these species underwent the kind of significant historical decline in the 18th and 19th century that pine marten and polecat and indeed wildcat did. This is probably due to their really high breeding productivity. So both species can potentially breed twice a year. And in stoats, young female stoats can actually be mated from when they're only 2 to 3 weeks old. So you can get this really, you know, highly productive system with lots of young being churned out. So whereas with polecats and pine martens, they're much slower breeders, so kind of more vulnerable to any like trapping or changes in their population. But for stoats and weasels, there's never been a national survey done, unlike for polecat and pine marten. And this is partly because they're actually really difficult to monitor and survey. This is something that we're trying to work on at the moment at VWT. So they are officially classed as data deficient, which means that we don't really know how they're doing now. Like, we don't know whether the populations are increasing or decreasing or staying the same. They are thought to be common and widespread though, and certainly are. They certainly are widespread. You know, they're found from all the way from like the south of England right up to the north of Scotland to the west of Wales, but we don't know anything about their numbers and how they might be changing. The only indications we have come from the game bag census, which is kind of provided by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. So this is data from people who carry out trapping and culling. So neither stoats or weasels are legally protected. So it's fine and legal to still trap them. And this is done in some areas, particularly around like game estates, where people are trying to raise high numbers of like pheasants or partridges. So yeah, the distribution, as I mentioned, they're both widely distributed, like maybe less so in Scotland, but they certainly are very widespread all over the country. But all we know about their trends, so this chart is from the National Game Bag Census from Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. So the top trend is for stoat. So you can see that stoat numbers kind of declined a lot from like the 70s, 80s into the 90s, but have been like increasing since then. So stoat numbers were really affected by the reduction in rabbits in the 1950s. So because like polecats, stoats eat a lot of rabbits, so it's thought that their like changes in their population might track changes in the rabbit populations. Whereas weasels have declined from the 1960s to the 1990s, but have been increasing since then. So it's possible that rabbit recovery has had a negative effect on field vole populations, because where rabbits graze a lot, you tend to get very short grass, which isn't so good for field voles. And that might have a negative knock-on for weasels, because weasels eat more field voles because they don't eat rabbits so much. So yeah, the population estimates for stoats and weasels are very much like finger in the air guesswork, but it's like it's said, it's just a guess. So stoats is 438,000, weasels is 450,000, but yeah, I would take that with a pinch of salt. So I'm just going to mention wildcats. So they're really the only one of our carnivores in Britain that hasn't recovered and isn't recovering and is still in like a pretty dire situation. So same as polecats and pine martens, wildcats declined a lot during the 18th and 19th century, and they became completely extinct in England and Wales and have really been restricted to the Scottish Highlands since then. Their main threat is hybridization with feral and domestic cats. So wildcats can breed with feral cats, farm cats, domestic cats. So the kind of wildcat gene has been diluted to create this kind of hybrid population. There've been several kind of consecutive like conservation projects for wildcats. Some have focused on trap, neuter and release programs. So this is where farm and feral cats and domestic cats are neutered so that wildcats can't breed with them. However, the kind of situation for wildcats has just gone like worse and worse. So there's the conclusion now is that the kind of true wildcat is probably functionally extinct in Scotland. So there might be a few wildcats left, but they're probably quite heavily hybridized. You know, the purity is kind of not there anymore. So yes, some estimates say there might be as few as 30 wildcats left in the whole of Scotland. And there have been kind of one of the things that's been really tricky for people working on wildcat conservation is how to distinguish between a true wildcat and a hybrid cat. And there are like pelage guides and scores that have been developed to help with that. So these are distribution maps from surveys that started in the 1960s. So the picture is very puzzling actually, because if you look from the map on the left to the next one, it looks like from the 1960s to the 80s, there was suddenly then loads more wildcats in the 80s. But this is probably because the criteria of what people classed, what people called a wildcat changed. So in that 1980 survey, a lot of those points will probably actually be hybrids rather than wildcats. So yeah, you can see that they're sort of really, their range is becoming really quite restricted. But there's a new project that's just started earlier this year called Saving Wildcats, which is a really big, ambitious project aiming to release or reintroduce wildcats into parts of Scotland. So yeah, the conclusion now is that if nothing is done, the wildcats, or the kind of cats that are out there, hybrids, whatever you want to call them, will just become fewer and fewer, and the population will just be this kind of hybrid swarm. So yeah, they need to reintroduce kind of pure wildcats to initiate this population recovery. So yeah, Saving Wildcats are now captive breeding, or for some time there's been captive breeding of wildcats going on, and their plan is to release these wildcats into the cairngorms in the next couple of years, and then hopefully we might see a kind of population starting to be restored. I'll just mention otters. So otters are another success story, but they kind of, as I mentioned at the start, and we've seen this photo before, otters kind of suffered really badly at the hands of humans. So otter hunting started in the Middle Ages, and then otter numbers in particular started to decline from the late 18th century onwards. So this was actually due to quite a lot of factors. So one would have been like predator control and hunting and trapping, but also pollution really, really badly affected otters. So in a study that was done like in the 60s and 70s, dieldrin, which was used as a sheep dip, was detected in 81% of otters. So this was how badly polluted our rivers were, and there was lots of kind of effluent and like wastewater from agriculture and industry just being like washed into the rivers. This was kind of, well, once people realised what was happening, there were voluntary restrictions placed on dieldrin use in particular in the 60s and 70s, and then there was a mandatory ban from the 1980s onwards. So once our rivers started to be cleared up, otters then kind of started back on the road to recovery. So otter surveys on a national level began in the 1970s, when people began to realise that otters weren't doing well at all and like weren't being seen on rivers where they used to be. And then there were also some reintroductions to kind of help the populations recover. So otters have been reintroduced in East Anglia and Hertfordshire and the kind of Upper Thames catchment in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, just some examples from recent surveys. So the 2009 to 2010 Otter Survey of Wales found that otters were present at 90% of sites. And then similarly in Scotland, otters were present at between 78 to 80% of sites in the most recent survey. And they're now present in every county in England. So yeah, otters are now widespread throughout most of Britain and are considered to be at carrying capacity in some areas and kind of increasingly recorded, moving into kind of urban areas. So yeah, otters have done really well. The latest population estimate for otters is 11,000. So yeah, here's just an example of how well they've done. So like if you look at kind of England in particular, looking at the map on the left from the 70s, like otters were hardly recorded anywhere in England in the 70s, like maybe just in the southwest and a bit in the kind of East Anglia. And then if you look at the map on the far right, yeah, particularly in kind of central and southern England, and up in the north, otters are now doing really well. And then I'll just throw badgers and foxes into the mix as well. So the badgers also kind of suffered during the 19th century because of human action. So the badger population declined, partly due to control by gamekeepers, but also they've also had to contend with things like set disturbance and also things like badger baiting. So yeah, that affected their numbers in the 19th century. They then started to recover from the mid 20th century, and badgers are now kind of doing fairly well. So in England and Wales, the number of badger social groups increased by 88% from the 80s to the 2010s. Although, as you'll know, widespread culling is ongoing in some areas for TB control. So yeah, I think badgers have kind of entered this new era of kind of conflict and control, and that's sort of like another issue altogether. But the latest estimate, population estimate nationally for badgers is 81,000 badger social groups. That's not badgers, that's social groups. And then, yeah, finally, foxes are an interesting one. So foxes didn't experience the really like severe historical decline that things like pine marten, polecat, wildcat did, but they have had some localized declines due to hunting pressure and also kind of local outbreaks of mange that affects them. And trends show that fox populations increased from the 1960s, then stabilized up to 2009. However, the most recent data is indicating a 45% decline in England from 1996 to 2016, which is worrying. And the causes of this decline aren't understood, but possibly might be related to a decline in the number of rabbits. So the latest population estimate for foxes is 357,000. So I'll just kind of briefly mention like the main drivers of carnivore recovery, which are slightly different for each species. But yeah, one of the main things that's really helped carnivores and helped them get to a kind of better position now than they were hundreds of years ago is kind of improved legislation or legal protection. So we have the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and most of our carnivores are kind of listed on that. So especially things like pine marten and polecat that are kind of very heavily protected on there. A reduction in like trapping and hunting and persecution has certainly helped pretty much all of our carnivores, so especially things like pine marten, otter, polecats and badgers. And then kind of concerted conservation efforts in terms of like translocations and reintroductions have helped to spread these species into new areas that they otherwise might have struggled to get to on their own. So that's certainly been the case for pine martens, otters and polecats. We've seen a big increase in woodland cover over the last 100 years, even though our woodland cover is still really low and well below most European countries. But yeah, we've gone from 5% at the beginning of the 20th century to 13% today. So that's for the whole of Britain. In Scotland, it's actually 18%. So yeah, that will have certainly helped pine martens and might have sort of helped provide habitats for some of our other carnivores as well. And then kind of improved quality of our rivers and kind of environment in general, and a reduction in persecution. So, sorry, reduction in pollution. That's certainly helped otters cleaning up our waterways, but has maybe helped other species also. But even though kind of the future is looking fairly bright, there are still a lot of threats to our carnivores that we shouldn't lose sight of. So the first one being persecution. So even though a lot of the carnivores have protection, legal protection, they are still vulnerable to being killed or injured, either intentionally or accidentally. So especially our kind of small, medium-sized carnivores are vulnerable to being injured or killed in these things called tunnel traps, which are also called fen traps. So this photo here was sent to us. This is a polecat that's managed to get itself into this trap. It was actually alive when it was found and was released and ran off, but you know, there's no guarantee it would have survived. So these traps are usually set specifically for weasels or stoats, or grey squirrels, or potentially rats. But yeah, polecats and potentially pine martens can get in them, and this could be a kind of real barrier to recovery and kind of especially things like pine martens and polecats moving into new areas. If there are areas that are heavily trapped, that might be a barrier for them. And of course, like cases like this are usually unreported, so it's really impossible to know the scale of the problem, because most of the times you wouldn't hear about it. So yeah, if we want to kind of promote ongoing carnivore recovery, and promoting responsible trapping practices will be really important, and kind of making landowners and gamekeepers and land managers aware of these carnivores coming back into their area, and the fact that they need to be aware of that when they're setting traps. Another kind of potential threat is second generation anticoagulant rodenticide. So this is basically rat poison. So anticoagulant poisons are used on farmland and kind of other landscapes to control, particularly to control rodents such as rats. But they don't just target rats. So when you poison a rat or a mouse, obviously there's a risk that something will then eat the rat or the mouse, and they will then ingest poison as well. So this has been highlighted as a particular issue for polecats. So because polecats rest in farm buildings, they might eat rats that have been poisoned, and then the polecats themselves will accumulate rodenticides, and this may then kill the polecats later in life. And this is a really hard one to study as well, because probably the data we have on this is like the tip of the iceberg, because it's impossible to assess exactly how many polecats might die or kind of have a shortened life or be affected by rodenticide poison. So we did some work on this a couple of years ago and found that in polecats that we collected between 2013 and 16, 79% of them, and 79% of polecats tested had detectable residues of one or more rodenticide. So nearly 80% of polecats have been exposed to rodenticides. And half of the polecats that we tested had residues of 2 or more different compounds, different rodenticide compounds. And this followed on from some testing that was done in the 90s, and this showed a 1.7-fold increase since the 90s. So this is a problem that's like increasing in magnitude and potentially getting worse. This increase in polecat exposure to rodenticides is thought to be for 2 reasons. One is increased use of rodenticides, so more people are using more rodenticides. But also because in the last couple of decades, polecats are likely, or we know they are eating more rodents, so particularly rats, due to a reduction in rabbit numbers. So there's some evidence that polecats are like shifting their diet slightly and eating more rodents. So just to put this into context, the bar that's highlighted, so this is the percentage of polecats exposed to rodenticides. So like I said, it was 79% in our study. But if you look at the other species on this chart, so we've got American mink and fishers. So fishers are like a species related to pine marten that occur in North America. Stoats and weasels, barn owl and red kite. So these are all predators that eat small rodents, so rats, mice, voles, that kind of thing. And you can see the proportion that have been exposed to rodenticide is between like 80 and 100%, which is like pretty terrifying. So yeah, this isn't just an issue that's kind of affecting polecats or even mammalian carnivores, it affects our birds of prey too. And then, kind of other threats on the horizon. So obviously hybridization is an ongoing threat and has been a threat for a while to wildcats and kind of feral and domestic cats. It's probably not a threat, but I just thought I'd mention polecats can hybridize with ferrets and create what we call polecat ferret hybrids. We don't think this is a threat to polecats because the polecat population is that much larger and can kind of withstand some level of hybridization compared to the wildcat population, which is very small. Obviously, there's always kind of new diseases on the horizon. So with badgers, we know that TB in badgers is an issue that's been going on for some time. We now have the new issue of COVID-19, which has been detected in some mustelids. So it's been detected in American mink at fur farms in several countries. We don't know whether it would become kind of prevalent in wild mink populations or other carnivore populations, but it's, you know, could potentially be an issue in the future. And then kind of habitat loss and fragmentation will always be an issue for these species. So yeah, depending on what their kind of main habitat preferences are. And finally, kind of human carnivore conflict, which, you know, where these species are coming into conflict with humans, it might lead to increased mortality. So one classic example is like otters and fisheries. So if otters are getting into ponds and taking fish, that brings them into conflict with anglers and people interested in fish. Another example would be like pine martens or polecats if they're taking poultry in areas where maybe people haven't got the best husbandry practices. This then brings them into conflict with people who are keeping poultry. So yeah, these will kind of always be issues that carnivores will have to deal with. So yeah, just to kind of summarize where we're kind of at now. So yeah, overall the outlook for British carnivores is more positive than at any time in the last 200 years. So in particular, pine marten, polecat and otter have made very significant population recoveries. Wildcats are the only species that haven't recovered and are threatened by hybridization. And then, as I mentioned, reintroductions are now required and will hopefully go ahead in the next couple of years. Badger and fox populations have generally increased, and stoat and weasel populations are unknown because they are data deficient. And yeah, kind of the big unknown is how the recent decline in rabbit populations may affect all of our carnivores that are kind of reliant or, you know, eat rabbits to some extent. So yeah, this is something that might become a cause for concern in the near future. And yeah, so in order to kind of keep seeing carnivores recover or keep promoting carnivore recovery, we need to promote kind of coexistence between carnivores and humans. So like the best practice use of rodenticides, selective predator control practices, and then kind of minimizing hybridization where it is an issue. So yeah, that's me done, and happy to take any questions. Shall I stop? Let's stop.
Hope you're all back. Does anyone want to jump straight in with some questions? Go for it, Emma.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting, and I have to be honest, I don't know sort of that much about mustelids at all, so it was really good and nice to have some positive wildlife news as well with populations increasing. I had quite a few questions. My first question, the reintroduction in mid Wales of the pine martens, who owned the land that was identified as the release sites? Was it sort of like Forestry Commission or privately owned, or like a mix of people?
Yeah, so it was owned by Natural Resources Wales, which is basically, it used to be the Forestry Commission and then it got kind of amalgamated into the other SNCOs in Wales. So yes, it was all public land, and that kind of made it easier logistically, I guess, because then you're just dealing with one major landowner, but also they owned all of the kind of suitable forestry in that area. So yes, it was Natural Resources Wales. And then in Scotland, all of the pine martens were also sourced from public land. So that was Forestry and Land Scotland, which is what used to be Forestry Commission as well.
Okay, cool. And then my other question was sort of like, how long do some of these species tend to live? Are they sort of short-lived or long-lived?
Yeah, very good question. So like the slightly larger species like pine marten can live up to sort of 10 years in the wild, and like chances are it might be a bit less. And then the smaller species like stoats and weasel might only live for kind of like 3 to 4 years. So yeah, somewhere in that kind of 3 to 10 or 11 years maybe to kind of cover them all.
Do they tend to have like their same spot? So like I think on Spring Watch and stuff, you sometimes see videos where people up in Scotland will see the same pine martens like all the time, sort of outside their house.
Yeah, so they have their territory that they'll kind of protect, and like with pine martens in particular, they mark their territory through their droppings. In fact all of the carnivores would do that. So yeah, they'll kind of frequently go around and like mark their territory so that any other animals that come by will know that that area is taken. And with pine martens, the males and females do overlap territories, but same sex don't. So like a male could have 2 females in his territory, but then 2 males wouldn't have any overlap in their territory.
Can they be quite aggressive or sort of?
Yeah, we don't know for sure. So there have been a couple of studies where people have been radio tracking and they've recorded some aggressive interactions between 2 pine martens. But in general with carnivores, it's kind of thought that obviously it's very risky for them to kind of have a fight or an altercation with another animal because they risk being injured or even being killed. So yeah, it's generally kind of thought that they will avoid kind of those like aggressive physical interactions if they can help it, because they have a lot to lose. So not too much is known about that, to be honest.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Thanks for your questions.
There's a question in the chat from Rhiannon saying, with the reintroduction programs, how do you decide on the number of individuals that you relocate?
Yeah, good question. So for the pine marten releases in Wales and in the Forest of Dean, that was done through a PVA, a population viability analysis model, which kind of looks at, so you kind of plug various numbers in and you'll kind of say like, okay, so if we released 30 animals, the chances of the population still being there in 20 years time is X percentage. If you release 40 animals, they have an X percentage chance of still being there in 20 years time. So yeah, for Wales and for the Forest of Dean, it kind of threw up a number between like 30 to 40 animals. So yeah, that was kind of how many was needed to like start a new population basically. And I think that's one of the big things that perhaps people don't understand, like that is quite a lot of animals. So yeah, I think people think you hear about people talking about reintroductions and say like, oh, we'll just release like 3 animals or 4 animals, but that's not going to work, because if you think, if one of them dies or one of them moves out of the area that you've released it to, which does happen, then you're suddenly left with very little. So yeah, it is quite a high number that you need. Yes, and the polecat question is very good. Polecats are doing well in Wales and England, but not in Scotland. So yes, in the future there might be cause for a reintroduction in Scotland, because there have been a couple of informal releases in Scotland, but it seems like the population hasn't kind of stuck. So yeah, it might be that reintroductions will be needed in the future if we want to see polecats kind of more widespread in Scotland.
I had a couple of questions too.
Yeah, go for it.
So you mentioned that the pine marten is seen as having sort of ecosystem services. So what sort of changes does the ecosystem see from its reintroduction?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that it's quite a lengthy topic. So I don't know if anyone's kind of seen this, it's been very covered in the media, but there has been some evidence to show that pine martens can suppress grey squirrel populations, which is obviously a good thing, because grey squirrels are non-native and invasive here, and obviously having a really detrimental impact on red squirrels. So yeah, there was a study done in Ireland and then in Scotland that showed that when pine martens started to recover and come back to kind of their old, like, former range in good numbers in Ireland and Scotland, grey squirrels started moving out of those areas or just disappearing altogether. And red squirrels then started moving back into the areas because the greys had gone. So yeah, it's been suggested that pine martens can help suppress grey squirrel populations, and the kind of mechanism for that relationship isn't very well known, but it might be that so obviously pine martens and red squirrels are both native to Britain and, well, the whole of Europe. So pine martens and red squirrels have coexisted together for thousands of years, and red squirrels have had to learn to kind of live with pine martens and learn how to avoid getting eaten by them. I mean, pine martens do eat red squirrels, but in very, very, very small numbers. Whereas because grey squirrels obviously aren't native here, they have come from an area. So where grey squirrels are native in North America, in most of their range, they don't overlap with a pine marten-like predator. And there is a part of their range where they overlap with the American pine marten. So yeah, grey squirrels are kind of naive to the threat of the pine marten. And there have been some, like, experimental studies that kind of back up that idea. So there have been some studies where people have these kind of squirrel feeders. I don't know if people have seen these, that like wooden feeders that go up on trees and you fill them with nuts. Yeah, there was a study where someone treated those feeders with different smells. So they treated some with the scent of pine marten and some with a control scent and some with nothing. And they found that red squirrels, if they went to the feeder that smelled like a pine marten, they stayed there for less time and they fed for less time, and they were kind of more vigilant, whereas grey squirrels kind of didn't react to the scent. Like, they were naive to it, like didn't know to be like afraid of it. So yeah, that's kind of one of the theories, but what we don't know is whether that relationship will be sustained. So whether, you know, grey squirrels over time will learn to be afraid of pine martens, and then they might be able to coexist in the same area as pine martens. But yeah, that kind of idea that pine martens might reduce grey squirrel populations has led to a huge amount of interest in people, particularly people in like the forestry industry, who are trying to grow trees, to want to reintroduce pine martens into areas, because they're like, oh yeah, if we have pine martens then there'll be no grey squirrels. But it's kind of not as simple as that, because there's still a lot about it that we don't understand. So yeah, in Wales we are hoping to do more work, because the pine marten population there is still relatively early days. We're hoping to do more work to kind of see if that does have an impact on the grey squirrels there, because not in the immediate release area, but kind of adjacent to the release area, there is a small population of red squirrels in that part of Wales, which is quite small and vulnerable. So yeah, anything that kind of helps them out by a reduction in grey squirrels would be beneficial.
And I just had another one about like the reintroductions that have happened in like Wales and Shropshire and the Forest of Dean. Like, was there sort of general acceptance, like sort of socially, from the people around? Like, was there any kind of concerns, or like has there been sort of instance of people like illegally killing them or poaching or anything since their reintroduction?
Yeah, so far so good, touch wood. So in Wales, when we did the kind of community consultation, generally people were really on board with it. There were a few cases where there was it was more like misunderstanding. So there's this kind of myth, some people think that pine martens can kill lambs and sheep, which there's never ever been a documented case of that. So yeah, it was more kind of people thinking things like that, and when you kind of so yeah, it's sort of correcting misinformation, I guess. Yeah, so like touch wood, it's kind of all been good, and yeah, nothing kind of no like major concerns have come to light. So yeah, so far so good.
I mean, this is, I guess, a bit off topic, but I remember like a couple of years ago there was like the campaign to like release some lynx into Cumbria. Were you guys involved with that at all, or like?
No, we're not, but that is still that group. They're called Lynx Trust UK or Lynx UK Trust. They are still trying. So yeah, they put in an application to Natural England to release lynx in Kielder Forest in Northumberland on the Scottish border, and it got rejected. And one of the reasons it got rejected was because Natural England weren't satisfied that there was enough community support, because there was a lot of, or there is a lot of concern in the farming community about lynx predation on sheep. So yeah, that group, they as far as I know, they are trying to put in another license application to Natural England, and have been doing some more kind of community consultation. But yeah, I think it's a hard win, that one, just because lynx are people are so unfamiliar with them because they haven't been here for, I think it's 1300 years, and yeah, because they do kill sheep, so that will always be a concern. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see kind of what happens with that one.
Has anyone else got any questions?
Can I ask about the rabbit population decreases?
Yeah.
Do we know what the causes of that are, and whether there's any plans to try and stabilize that?
Yeah, so it's thought that, so obviously in the past myxomatosis has really badly affected rabbit populations, but the current disease that's here is rabbit hemorrhagic disease, rabbit hemorrhagic, something like that. Viral rabbit hemorrhagic disease, I think it's called. But the thing is, I don't know too much about it, to be honest, but so one of the issues, or my understanding with that, is that like myxomatosis, it's quite I guess like a visible disease, because if you see rabbits with mixy and like they don't look well and they've got like whereas this viral hemorrhagic disease, the rabbits, once they contract it, they die very quickly, like I think within 48 hours, and would just die underground in their burrows. So it's like, I guess it's not a very kind of visible disease, because people wouldn't really notice if rabbits are just going underground to die. So yeah, that seems to be the main driver of the decline. But because no one really works on rabbits and no one is kind of doing national rabbit surveys or anything, there's not good data on it. So I think it seems to be quite localized, and like in some areas people are saying, oh yeah, we don't really have rabbits here anymore, but then like just anecdotally, like here where I live, I feel like I still see quite a lot of rabbits. So yeah, I think that's the main problem, is there's kind of no systematic survey effort or like no good data on it, and it might end up that rabbits do disappear or become very scarce, and then people won't have really noticed until it's too late. So it's an interesting one.
I don't think around here that I wasn't really aware that there was a decline at all in rabbit populations, but I grew up in like North Yorkshire, and I remember sort of when I was growing up sort of seeing a lot more rabbits that clearly had mixy and noticing it a lot more, whereas I think a lot of people probably, if I sort of said, oh, did you know rabbit populations were declining, I don't think anyone would sort of really know, even amongst sort of friends who are quite sort of nature kind of minded. So and I think that's probably one of the issues. But it's interesting because, of course, rabbits aren't native here. They're considered sort of naturalized because they've been here since the Roman times, I think. But yes, so many of our predators are really reliant on them. So polecats, stoats, buzzards, kites, like lots of our birds of prey, and then other species that kind of scavenge dead rabbits on the road. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And I guess the concern is that if all of our predators that do eat a lot of rabbits
if rabbits suddenly become really scarce, is then it brings those predators into competition more, and they'll all have to switch to like other small mammals or amphibians or birds, and then yeah, it kind of puts that pressure on them. So yeah, it will be really interesting to see how that kind of plays out. I think the Mammal Society are keen to do something on rabbits and kind of get more information on rabbits.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
I did have one more question, I realised.
Yeah, go for it.
What's a gin trap? Because it sort of sounds all right to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's nothing to do with that kind of gin, unfortunately. Yeah, it's just a kind of metal trap that kind of opens, like you set it like this, and then it's like a spring, and so if something walks on it, it then closes, and so it would catch something by the leg. So yeah, they were banned in the 1950s, although I think some people did still continue to use them for a while. So yeah, they were used really commonly to catch rabbits, but then a lot of other species would accidentally get caught in them. So yeah, then as far as I know, they're not around anymore, but yeah, they were these kind of like metal, like snap traps. Yeah.
I remember I did a training day once with the North York Moors National Park Authority on like spotting illegal traps and poison and stuff, and they had one there as a demonstration, and it was like, it looked really gruesome. It's like some kind of medieval torture thing. It's horrible.
Yeah.
But obviously they are still occasionally used illegally, so it was sort of like training to help their rangers and stuff like spot them. To see with the presence of like gamekeeping up in the North York Moors. So
yeah, it has a pretty bad reputation, that area, doesn't it, for sort of trapping and lots of birds of prey going missing, and yeah. Oh, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it was good. It was a long time ago now, but I can't remember all the different traps and stuff, but it was really good. And I still sort of remember being just amazed by, I think it gave me an appreciation for how hard it is for the rangers to actually try and keep on top of this sort of stuff, because unless you just happen to come across it, most of it's hidden, which I think is sort of like you were saying with the tunnel traps. It's so hard to understand what's happening.
Yeah, that's it. And I think, occasionally someone's out hiking and they come across something like, yeah, I have occasionally come across tunnel traps in Scotland, but it's really occasional. Yeah.
Awesome. Has anyone else got any questions? I think we're all good then.
All good.
All good. If you do think of any more questions, feel free to drop me an email and I can forward it on to Lizzie. And like I said, this has been recorded, so I'll share it either tomorrow or Friday with